Rain needled the glass of a 30-story window, blurring the city below into a smear of gold and red light. Somewhere beneath that blur, 7 million people were going about their small, unremarkable lives, utterly unaware that on this particular rooftop, above a shuttered textile warehouse on the east side, a man was deciding whether one of them would live to see morning. His name was Damian Voss. The underworld knew him by a different name. They called him the Silence, because wherever Damian Voss walked, screaming stopped. Debts vanished. Enemies disappeared. Cities changed hands without a single headline. In 11 years, no journalist had published his photograph. No court had ever spelled his name correctly. He did not attend galas or funerals. He did not give interviews. He existed the way certain diseases exist, spoken of in hushed tones, feared without being seen. Damian knelt in the dark behind a rusted air vent, a suppressed rifle braced against his shoulder, his eye pressed to a scope that turned the night into pale green daylight. 600 meters away, on the third floor of a converted loft building, a woman moved behind gauzy curtains, laughing at something on her phone. Her name, according to the manila folder his second-in-command had delivered that afternoon, was Ava Bennett, 28 years old, forensic accountant, no criminal record, no known affiliations, a woman who spent her days chasing decimal points through spreadsheets and her nights watering a dying basil plant on her windowsill. And, according to the commission, the 12 men who ruled the criminal underworld from behind closed doors, a woman who had, without knowing it, uncovered a ledger capable of burying every family in the empire at once. She dies tonight, the voice on the phone had said. Clean. No mess. No name. Damian's finger rested against the trigger guard, not the trigger. He had done this 700 times. He had never once hesitated. He was hesitating now. Through the scope, Ava Bennett stopped laughing. She set the phone down. She walked to the window, his crosshairs, and pressed her palm flat against the cold glass, staring out at the rain as if she could feel eyes on her skin. For 3 full seconds, it seemed she was looking directly at him. Damian Voss, a man who had buried his own conscience so deep he sometimes forgot he'd once had one, felt something crack open in his chest like a door long bricked shut. He lowered the rifle. Sir. The voice crackled in his earpiece. Nico, his second-in-command, waiting in the car 4 blocks away. Talk to me. Is it done? Damian stared at the woman in the window a moment longer. Rain ran down the glass in front of him like tears that weren't his to cry. Not tonight, he said quietly, and for the first time in 11 years, the silence broke his own rule. He would learn her name before he ended her life. He did not yet know it would be the last decision he ever made as a man without a heart. To understand what Damian Voss became, you had to understand what was taken from him. At 9 years old, he had hidden inside a kitchen pantry while men in dark coats walked through his family's house with guns drawn and voices flat as concrete. He remembered the smell of gunpowder and his mother's rosewater perfume mixing in the air. He remembered counting 1, 2, 3, the way his father had taught him to do when he was frightened, and reaching 111 before the house went silent. When the silence finally became unbearable, he crawled out of the pantry and found his parents on the kitchen floor and a man standing over them, calmly wiping a blade on a dish towel. That man's name was Alexander Kane. Kane looked at the boy the way a sculptor looks at raw stone, not with guilt, but with possibility. You didn't run, Kane said. You didn't cry. Good. Crying is for boys who die young. He crouched to the child's eye level. I'm going to raise you now, and one day, you will thank me for this. Damian never understood, in the 26 years since, whether that thank you had ever actually left his lips. But he had become exactly what Kane built him to be. Precise, unfeeling, loyal only to the Empire, incapable, he believed, of being hurt again, because he had made absolutely sure there was nothing left inside him soft enough to break. He rose through the Empire's ranks not through cruelty alone, but through a terrifying, surgical intelligence. He didn't rule through fear. He ruled through inevitability. Cross Damian Voss, and consequences did not arrive loudly. They arrived quietly, on schedule, like a bill finally coming due. By 35, he sat atop an empire that spanned shipping routes, shell corporations, and 3 continents of laundered money. An empire whose entire foundation rested on a secret so carefully buried that only 12 men, the Commission, knew its full shape. Ava Bennett had found a thread of it by accident. She was, by every account, an ordinary woman leading an ordinary life, if you didn't count the fire in her. Ava had grown up the daughter of a bookkeeper who died when she was 19, leaving behind more questions than answers and a debt she spent years quietly paying off rather than declaring bankruptcy, because, she told her best friend Maya once, somebody has to keep their word, even after they're gone. She'd built a modest but respected career auditing corporate books, the kind of unglamorous work that occasionally, almost by accident, uncovered rot beneath the polish. 6 weeks before Damian Voss looked at her through a rifle scope, a routine audit for a logistics company named Halcyon Freight had crossed her desk. Buried in 11 years of invoices, she'd found a pattern that didn't belong. Numbers that moved money, not goods. She hadn't known what she'd found. She only knew it didn't add up, and Ava Bennett was constitutionally incapable of leaving a number that didn't add up alone. She flagged it, forwarded it to a compliance officer, went home, watered her basil plant. She had no idea that the compliance officer worked, 3 shell companies removed, for Alexander Kane, and that her name had reached the Commission within 48 hours. She had no idea a man had been sent to kill her. She had no idea that same man was now sitting in a diner 4 blocks from her apartment at 2 in the morning, staring at a folder with her photograph in it, wondering, for the first time since he was 9 years old, what it might feel like to want something other than silence. Ava met Damian Voss on a Tuesday, in the produce aisle of a 24-hour grocery store, and neither of them said his real name once. She was reaching for the last ripe avocado when a man's hand closed over the same one. Dark coat, tired eyes that looked like they'd seen too much and slept too little. He withdrew his hand instantly. "Sorry," he said. "It's yours." "We could split it," Ava said, before she could stop herself, because that was who she was. She talked to strangers, fed stray cats, believed most people were fundamentally decent even when the evidence suggested otherwise. "I only need half anyway." Toast. Damian Voss, who had not made unscripted small talk with a stranger in over a decade, found himself saying, "I don't actually cook." "Tragic," Ava said, and smiled, and took the avocado, and cut it clean in half right there against the edge of the produce scale, and held one half out to him wrapped in a napkin like it was the most natural transaction in the world. He should have declined. He should have left. Instead he took it, and said, "Thank you," in a voice that hadn't said those 2 words together, and meant them, in longer than he could remember. "You look like someone who forgets to eat," Ava said, studying him the way she studied a spreadsheet that didn't balance. "Rough week. Rough decade," he said, and it startled a real laugh out of her, surprised, warm, entirely unguarded. "I'm Ava." He almost gave her a false name. It would have been easy. He had 4 of them memorized for casual use. Instead, something in him, the same crack that had opened on the rooftop, made him say, "Damian." Just Damian. True, for once, and terrifying for exactly that reason. They talked for 11 minutes by the register, about nothing, about avocados and bad coffee, and the particular loneliness of grocery shopping at 2 a.m., and then Ava said she had an early meeting, and left, and Damian Voss stood alone under fluorescent light, holding half an avocado in a paper napkin like it was evidence of a crime he had no intention of confessing. Nico was waiting in the car outside. "Well," Nico asked, "is she dead?" Damian looked at the napkin in his hand for a long moment before answering. "She's complicated," he said, and Nico, who had known Damian Voss for 15 years and had never once heard him describe a target as anything but a name and a location, felt the first cold thread of unease settle into his stomach. That night, Nico made a phone call Damian didn't know about, to a man neither of them had spoken to in years. "Voss is hesitating," Nico said quietly. "I think we have a problem." The voice on the other end, smooth, patient, ancient with menace, replied, "Then let's make sure the problem solves itself." Damian told himself it was reconnaissance. He told himself that watching Ava Bennett from a parked car 3 nights running, learning the rhythm of her life, the coffee shop she visited at 7:10 a.m., the elderly neighbor whose groceries she carried up 4 flights of stairs, the way she talked to her dying basil plant like it could hear her, was simply due diligence. A professional understanding his target before the final act. He was lying to himself, and some cold, clinical part of his mind knew it. On the 4th night, it began to rain, and Ava came out of her building without an umbrella, laughing at her own bad luck, and Damian, against every instinct that had kept him alive for 11 years, got out of the car. "You again," Ava said, when she saw him under the awning, and she didn't sound suspicious. She sounded pleased, which was so much worse for him. "I was in the neighborhood," he lied. "Twice in 1 week." Her eyes were sharp, amused, entirely too perceptive. "Damian, are you following me?" The question landed like a blade between his ribs, because the honest answer was yes, and the fact that he felt guilt about it. Actual, physical guilt, a sensation he associated with the inefficiency of lesser men, told him something in his carefully constructed architecture was failing. "Would that be so terrible?" he asked instead, watching her. Ava considered this with the same seriousness she gave a column of numbers. "Depends," she said. "Are you dangerous?" "More than you will ever know," he thought. "I used to be," he said aloud, and it was, in its own way, the truest thing he'd said in years. She invited him for coffee under the awning while the rain fell, and for 40 minutes Damian Voss, a man the commission trusted to end lives without a flicker of hesitation, sat across from a woman with wet hair and an oversized cardigan and listened to her talk about her late father, about numbers that didn't add up, about the quiet, stubborn belief that the world could be made a little more honest one audit at a time. "You have a strange look on your face," Ava said at one point. "What kind of look?" "Like you're trying to remember something you're not supposed to remember." She studied him, unafraid, the way she seemed to study everything. "Or maybe forget something you can't." He didn't answer, because the true answer was, "I am trying to remember why I came here to kill you, and I am failing, and that failure feels like the first real thing I have felt in 26 years. That night, back in the cold marble tower that served as the Empire's headquarters, Alexander Kane summoned him. "The Bennett contract," Kane said, without looking up from his desk. "It's been 4 days. I'm establishing her patterns," Damian said. "A clean kill requires patience." Kane's eyes lifted, pale, unreadable, the eyes of a man who had raised a son the way other men raised weapons. "Patience," he repeated slowly. "Or attachment?" Damian's expression did not change. It was the only skill Kane had ever truly succeeded in teaching him. "I don't get attached," he said. "Good," Kane said. "Because the woman dies by Friday, or I begin to wonder whether the man I built has started to rust." He returned to his papers, dismissing him. "Rusted things get replaced, Damian. Even the ones I love best." Damian left the office with his pulse steady and his hands perfectly still, and it wasn't until he was alone in the elevator, watching the floor numbers fall, that he allowed himself to acknowledge the truth clawing at the walls of his chest. He did not want Ava Bennett dead. He wanted, for the first time in his adult life, something for himself, and the commission had just given him a deadline to destroy it. Friday arrived with a twist Damian never saw coming, because it didn't come from the commission. It came from Ava herself. She called him, she'd taken his number, in the easy, trusting way she did everything, and asked if he wanted to see something insane. "I found the strangest thing in an old audit," she said, spreading printouts across her kitchen table while Damian stood in her doorway, feeling like a man walking willingly into his own execution. "A shipping company, Halcyon Freight, moving container weights that don't match manifest weights. Not once. Consistently, for 11 years. Somebody's been hiding something inside these numbers, Damian, and I think it's big." Damian looked down at the papers and felt the floor tilt beneath him. He recognized the shell structure instantly. He'd helped build parts of it himself, a decade ago, before he understood what he was building. Halcyon Freight was the Empire's central laundering artery. The numbers in front of him, innocently printed on cheap paper by a woman who thought she'd found an accounting curiosity, were in fact a roadmap capable of unraveling 3 continents of criminal infrastructure and putting Alexander Kane and the entire commission behind bars for the rest of their lives. "You should stop looking into this," Damian said, more urgently than he meant to. Ava blinked, surprised by his tone. "Why?" "Because some numbers," he said carefully, "are attached to people who don't like being found." "That's exactly why they need to be found," Ava said, and there it was again, that fearless, infuriating decency that had first cracked him open on the rooftop. "Damian, if this is what I think it is, people could be getting hurt because of this money. I can't just look away because it's dangerous. That's not who I am." He almost told her, right then, standing in her kitchen with rain still drying in his hair. "I know exactly whose money this is, because it's mine. I know exactly how dangerous this is, because I was sent to kill you over it. Instead, he said, "Then let me help you." It was, in its own quiet way, the most reckless decision of his life, more dangerous than any hit he had ever carried out. Because in that moment, Damian Voss chose a side against the empire that had raised him, and he did it for a woman who didn't yet know his real name. Later that night, alone in his penthouse, Damian opened a drawer he hadn't touched in years and took out a photograph, the only one he owned of his parents, taken weeks before Alexander Kane walked into their kitchen and rebuilt their son from the wreckage. His mother was laughing in the photo. His father had his arm around her. Damian had never let himself wonder, until tonight, what kind of man he might have become if that kitchen had stayed quiet. His phone buzzed. A text from Nico. Kane wants confirmation the Bennett job is done. He's asking questions. Watch yourself. Damian stared at the message for a long time. Then, for the first time in his life, he typed a lie to the only father he had ever known. "It's done," he wrote. "She won't be a problem again." He did not yet know that Nico had already told Kane the opposite, and that somewhere in the marble tower, a decision had already been made to remove Damian Voss from the equation entirely. The war did not begin with the commission. It began with the Kozlov Bratva, a rival organization that had spent a decade waiting for exactly this kind of fracture. Viktor Kozlov had built his empire on patience and grudges, and he had a very specific grudge against Alexander Kane, dating back to a shipment of arms that had vanished 8 years earlier along with 11 of Viktor's men. He had been waiting for a crack in Kane's foundation ever since, and Nico Alvarez, desperate, ambitious, and quietly furious at having spent 15 years as Damian's shadow instead of his equal, had just handed him one. "Voss is compromised," Nico told Viktor over an encrypted line 3 nights after Damian lied to Kane. "He's protecting the Bennett woman. If the ledger she's holding ever surfaces, it takes down Kane, the commission, all of it. But if you move first, if you take the ledger and the woman before Kane cleans house, you own the endgame instead of him." Viktor Kozlov smiled the way men smile when a decade of patience finally pays a dividend. "And Voss, Nico said, won't see it coming. Neither will Kane. I'll make sure of both." The attack came at dawn, 4 days later, and it came at Ava's apartment building. 6 armed men in unmarked vehicles, moving with the brutal efficiency of a crew that had done this before. They were not there to negotiate. They were there to take the ledger. And if the woman who carried its origin in her memory had to disappear along with it, that was simply the cost of doing business. Damian was 2 blocks away when his police scanner, one of 11 he monitored, crackled with a call about gunfire on Ava's street. He broke every rule of tradecraft he had ever taught himself, abandoned the car mid-intersection, and ran. He arrived to find the building's lobby already breached, a security guard bleeding on the marble floor, and Ava backed into a stairwell with a fire extinguisher gripped in both hands like a woman who had decided that if she was going down, she would go down swinging. Damian moved through the 2 men blocking the stairwell with a speed and precision that made Ava's blood run cold. Not because she was afraid of him, but because in those 30 seconds, she finally understood, with total clarity, exactly what kind of man had been drinking coffee in her kitchen. When it was over, 4 men down, 2 fled, Ava unhurt, but shaking with adrenaline. She stared at him across the wreckage of the lobby, gun still loose in his hand, and asked the question he had been dreading since the produce aisle. "Who are you really, Damian?" He could have lied. He had a lifetime of practice. "My name is Damian Voss," he said instead, quiet and steady, watching something in her eyes shift and reassess and not yet, mercifully, run. "And 6 days ago, I was sent to kill you." The silence that followed lasted 11 seconds. Ava counted every one of them. "Then why?" she finally asked, voice shaking but not breaking. "Am I still alive?" Damian looked at her, really looked, the way he hadn't let himself look at another human being in 26 years, and answered with the only truth he had left. "Because somewhere between the rooftop and the avocado, I stopped being able to do my job." Trust, in Damian Voss's world, was a currency more dangerous than money, and he had just spent the last of his on a woman who had every right to run from him, and, astonishingly, didn't. "I need you to explain everything," Ava said. Once they were behind a locked door in a safe house Damian kept for exactly this kind of catastrophe, 3 rooms above a laundromat that officially didn't exist. All of it. Now. So he did. He told her about the Empire, about Halcyon Freight, about the Commission, about a 12-year-old boy who had counted to 111 in a dark pantry and come out the other side as a weapon with a man's face. He told her about Alexander Kane, not as a villain in a story, but as the only father he had ever known, and the man who had, 6 days ago, ordered her death. Ava listened without flinching, which unsettled him more than screaming would have. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, turning the fire extinguisher's dented handle over in her hands like it grounded her. "Your own father sent you to kill me," she said finally. "Kane isn't my father. He's the man who made sure I'd never have one again." "That's not an answer to what I asked," Ava said, gently but precisely, the way she'd corrected a decimal point 100 times in her career. "Are you going to keep protecting me because it's right, Damian? Or because it's the first time in your life someone's made you feel like a person instead of a weapon?" He had no answer for her, because both were true, and he had never in his life had to hold 2 true things at once without one of them being a lie. The betrayal, when it came, arrived through the one door Damian had never thought to guard. Nico found them by mid-afternoon, not through skill, but because Damian, for the first time in 15 years, had trusted his second-in-command enough to tell him where the safe house was, for days before any of this began. "You lied to Kane," Nico said, standing in the doorway with 2 of Viktor Kozlov's men flanking him, and Damian understood, in the half-second before anyone spoke again, the full shape of the trap he'd walked into. 15 years, Damian. I carried your bags. I cleaned your messes. I stood 2 steps behind you at every meeting while Kane called you his son and called me the help. Do you have any idea what that does to a man? Nico. Victor's going to give me the West Corridor, Nico said, and his voice cracked with something that might have once been loyalty and had curdled, slowly, into something else entirely. All I have to do is bring him the ledger and the girl. You were never supposed to be a complication, Damian. You were supposed to just do the job, like you always do. You sold me out, Damian said, and the words tasted like ash, like the particular grief of realizing a wound had been bleeding for years before you noticed it. I saved myself, Nico corrected. There's a difference, and you taught it to me yourself. Ava's hand found Damian's arm, not out of fear, but steadying, grounding, the way she'd once talked to a dying plant like it could still be saved. Whatever happens next, she said quietly, you are not the boy in that pantry anymore. Remember that. Nico raised his weapon, and in the half-second before the safe house erupted into chaos, Damian Voss realized the most dangerous truth of his entire life. The empire that raised him, the brother he trusted, and the woman he had somehow, impossibly, fallen in love with were all about to collide in the same room, and only one version of his future would walk out of it. The gunfight lasted 90 seconds and felt like an hour. Damian got Ava behind an overturned steel table as bullets chewed through drywall, and in the strange, adrenaline-slowed clarity of combat, he found himself doing something he had never once done in 11 years of violence. Calculating not the most efficient way to end the threat, but the safest way to keep another person alive. He took a graze along his ribs, pulling her out of a sight line. He didn't notice until later. Nico's men fell back when Kozlov's promised reinforcements didn't arrive on schedule, a small mercy, and Damian would later learn, no mercy at all, but a deliberate delay engineered by a man playing a much longer game than anyone in that room understood. Nico himself vanished into the stairwell, shouting that this wasn't over, that Damian had chosen wrong, that Kane would learn the truth by nightfall. In the ringing silence afterward, Ava pressed a torn strip of her own shirt against the wound in Damian's side, her hands shaking but sure, and said the thing that would haunt him for days afterward. You had a clean shot at him. Nico, you could have ended this. I know, Damian said. Why didn't you? Because some threads, however frayed, take a lifetime to cut cleanly, he thought. But what he said was, because I'm trying to be a different kind of man than the one who raised me, and I don't know yet if that man is capable of mercy or just hesitation. I didn't want to find out over Nico's body. Ava studied him with an expression he was beginning to recognize, not judgment, but the particular tenderness of someone deciding, in real time, to believe in a person anyway. That's the first human thing you've said to me all day, she said. The rest was all mafia boss. That was Damian. That night, bandaged and exhausted, they sat together on the safe house floor with the city glittering coldly through a cracked window, and Damian told her, quietly, without armor, the way he had never told anyone, about the pantry, about counting to 111, about Kane's hand on his shoulder, and the terrible gratitude he'd been trained to feel for the man who orphaned him and then owned him. He didn't save you, Ava said softly. He replaced you. There's a difference, and I think some part of you has always known it. If I walk away from the Empire, Damian said, Kane will hunt both of us until one of us is dead. There's no clean version of this, Ava. Loving you and surviving this life were never going to be the same choice. Then don't choose survival, Ava said, taking his hand, unafraid even now, especially now. Choose which version of yourself you actually want to be when this is over. The rest is just logistics. It was, Damian thought, the single bravest sentence anyone had ever said to him, braver than anything he'd ever done with a gun in his hand, and it was in that quiet, bloodied, cracked window moment that Damian Voss finally understood. Duty had built the man he used to be. But love, terrifying and inconvenient and entirely unearned, was going to be what finally made him a person. He did not yet know that Alexander Kane had already learned everything, and that the real betrayal, the one that would break the story wide open, hadn't come from Nico at all. Alexander Kane received Nico in the marble tower at midnight, listened to his account of the safe house, the girl, Damian's treachery, without interrupting once. When Nico finished, breathless with his own righteousness, Kane folded his hands and studied him the way he had once studied a 9-year-old boy in a blood-soaked kitchen. You did well, Kane said finally, and Nico exhaled, relieved. You confirmed something I have suspected for 11 years. Sir, that loyalty bought with fear always breaks the moment someone offers a better price, Kane said. You sold Damian to Viktor Kozlov for a corridor and a title. Do you imagine, for one moment, that I will hand my empire to a man who trades this cheaply? Nico's confidence cracked. Kane, You've been useful, Kane said, standing. Usefulness has an expiration date. Yours arrived tonight. Nico did not leave the marble tower alive, and in that single cold sentence lay the truth of everything Damian had never let himself fully see. Alexander Kane did not build family. He built instruments, used precisely until they failed him, and discarded without ceremony. Damian had simply been the instrument that never failed, until now. Kane's real move came at dawn. Not against Nico. Not even against Ava. He came for Damian directly, arriving at the safe house not with soldiers, but alone, in a plain gray coat, exactly as he had once arrived in a kitchen 26 years earlier. Stand down, Kane said to the 2 men Damian had posted outside, and they did, because no one in the Empire had ever learned to disobey that voice. Inside, he found Damian standing between him and Ava, and for the first time in 26 years, father and son faced each other as adversaries. You lied to me, Kane said, almost gently. You let a woman with the power to end everything I built walk free, and you lied to my face about it. Do you understand what that means? It means I finally understand what you actually are, Damian said. Not a father. An architect. You didn't raise a son in that kitchen, Cain. You built a tool and called it love because it was easier for both of us to believe. Cain's expression did not change, but something in his eyes did. A flicker, brief and involuntary, of something that might, in another life, have been grief. I gave you power, purpose, a place in a world that would have chewed you up as an orphan with nothing. You gave me a cage and told me it was a home, Damian said. I believed you for 26 years. I stopped believing you the moment I met a woman who never once asked me to be anything other than what I actually was. Then came the twist no one in that room saw coming. Not Damian, not Ava, and least of all Alexander Cain. There's something you don't know, Cain said quietly, and for the first time in his life, Damian heard something almost like fear in the old man's voice. About that night in the kitchen. About who actually gave the order to kill your parents. The room went utterly still. I didn't just find you in that pantry, Damian, Cain said. I was sent there. By the commission. Your father wasn't just a bookkeeper who died in the wrong place at the wrong time. His eyes flicked, just once, toward Ava. He was Halcyon Freight's original architect. The ledger she found. The numbers that could end everything. Your father built that system 30 years ago, before he tried to walk away from it. I didn't save you that night, Damian. Cain's voice dropped almost to nothing. I was ordered to make sure there were no survivors. I only spared you because, for one moment, standing over that boy who didn't cry, I saw something I wanted to keep instead of destroy. Ava's breath caught audibly. Damian felt the floor of his entire life tilt sideways. My father, he said slowly, built the empire that killed him. And Ava's discovery, Cain said, isn't an accident of fate, Damian. Halcyon Freight's shell structure carries your father's signature encoding, a system only 3 people alive would recognize. I recognized it the day her audit crossed my desk. That is the real reason I sent you to kill her. Not because of what she found. His gaze was almost pitying. Because of what she would eventually help you remember. For a long moment, no one in the room moved. Damian Voss, a man who had spent 26 years believing his life began in a blood-soaked kitchen with a stranger's mercy, understood, with sudden and total clarity, that his entire existence had been built on a lie constructed to keep him loyal to the very organization that orphaned him. His father had not been an innocent bystander. His father had built the machine. And Alexander Cain had not saved a helpless child out of some flicker of decency. He had preserved a valuable asset and spent 26 years disguising that transaction as love. You used my grief, Damian said quietly, to build your best weapon. I used your grief, Cain corrected, without shame, to build the only thing I ever actually loved. Believe that or don't, Damian. It changes nothing about what happens next. He glanced toward Ava. The commission still wants her dead. That order does not disappear because you've had a revelation in a laundromat safe house. If you protect her, they will come for both of you, and I will not be able to stop them a second time. Then I'm not asking you to stop them, Damian said. I'm ending this. Tonight. All of it. The Empire, the Commission, Halcyon Freight. Everything my father built, and everything you turned me into. You'll destroy yourself. I already did that, Damian said, 26 years ago, in a kitchen, without ever noticing. He looked at Ava, steady, certain, finally choosing. I'd rather be destroyed as a man who chose right once than survive as the thing you built me to be. What followed was not another gunfight. It was something rarer, and in its own way more dangerous. Damian Voss walked into the Commission's next closed-door meeting 3 days later, and did what no one in the Empire's history had ever survived doing. He laid Ava's ledger, copied, verified, cross-referenced with his father's original encoding, and quietly distributed to 4 separate federal agencies and 2 investigative journalists as insurance. On the table in front of 12 of the most powerful criminals in the country, and told them the Empire was finished. You'll die for this, one of the commission members said. Maybe, Damian said. But you'll all go to prison first. And every dollar you've laundered through Halcyon Freight for 30 years will be traced, frozen, and seized before any of you can touch me. I made sure of that this morning. So the only real question left in this room, he said, meeting Kane's eyes last, is whether any of you still believe fear is worth more than what it costs. Alexander Kane, in the end, made the only choice that had ever genuinely surprised his adopted son. He did not order the kill. He sat in silence as federal agents entered the building 6 hours later, having been tipped by one of the two journalists Damian trusted, and when they placed him in restraints, he looked at Damian one last time and said, simply, "You were always the best thing I ever built. I only wish I'd built you with love instead of loss." It was not forgiveness. It was not absolution. But it was, perhaps, the closest thing to truth the two of them had ever exchanged, and Damian let it be enough. The Empire did not survive the week. Viktor Kozlov, deprived of the chaos he'd engineered, retreated to lick his wounds and wait for a different opportunity, a threat that remained, quietly, on the horizon, because some stories don't end so much as they change shape. But the commission fell. Halcyon Freight's 30 years of hidden money surfaced into daylight. And Damian Voss, no longer the silence, no longer anyone's weapon, walked out of a federal building at dusk into the arms of a woman who had never once been afraid of him, not because she didn't understand what he was, but because she had seen, before anyone else ever bothered to look, what he could still become. "You gave up everything," Ava said, against his chest, rain starting to fall around them the way it had the night they met. "I gave up a cage," Damian said. "I finally understand the difference. There is a particular kind of darkness that convinces a person they were built for nothing else. That cruelty, once it shapes you young enough, becomes the only shape you're capable of holding." Damian Voss believed that for 26 years. He believed it in every life he ended, every order he followed, every quiet moment he mistook silence for peace. It took one woman's refusal to be afraid of him to prove the darkness had lied. Ava Bennett never set out to save a monster. She only ever insisted on being decent, curious, and unflinchingly herself. In a produce aisle, in a rainstorm, in a safe house with bullets in the walls. And it turned out that decency, offered without condition to a man who had never once received it, was more dangerous to an empire than any bullet ever could be. Their story is not a fairy tale. It cost them everything they thought they knew about who they were. It cost Damian the only father figure he'd ever had, however poisoned that bond turned out to be. It nearly cost Ava her life a dozen times over. But it proved something worth the cost, that the coldest heart, built by loss and trained by cruelty, can still remember how to feel, if someone brave enough refuses to let it forget. Somewhere out there, the story goes, a man who was once called the Silence now wakes up every morning beside the woman who taught him that love isn't weakness. It's the last thing any empire can ever buy.